All right. As it says on the screen in front of you, my name is Melissa McChesney. I am the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Public Policy Priorities on the Health and Wellness team. And I will be hosting the webinar today. Joining me is also my boss and longtime healthcare advocate, Ann Dunkelberg. The way that we're going to split this up today is I'll be presenting the content, but Ann, with her best experience and knowledge, will be here to answer questions. So we're going to go through the different sections of the webinar, but we'll have two different sections, and at the end of the first section, we'll make sure to stop for Q&A, and at the end of the second section, we'll have some additional time at the end for Q&A. And then if there are questions, so as questions occur to you as we go through the content, please do put them in the chat box. There may be some that we take as we find them if they're specifically relevant, and it'll be helpful to have the slide in front of you. So we'll do sort of a mixture of the two things. So introducing myself, like I said, I'm the Outreach Coordinator at the Center for Public Policy Priorities on the Health and Wellness team. And prior to joining the center back in January of 2015, I worked at the Health and Human Service Commission on the Medicaid and CHIP eligibility policy team that implemented all of the changes required under the Affordable Care Act. As we're going to talk about today, while Texas was not required to expand Medicaid to the new adult population, often referred to as the Medicaid expansion population, that became essentially optional because of a Supreme Court ruling that did not mean that they had the option to implement the other changes that were required under the Affordable Care Act. So the majority of those changes impact how the household composition and income of an individual is counted in those for eligibility for most Medicaid and CHIP programs are what we referred to last week as MAGI programs. So today we're going to take a deeper dive. Last week we looked at the eligibility process and how that coordinates with the marketplace, and then the specific categories that we're talking about when we're talking about MAGI-based Medicaid. This week we're gonna explore what that means, MAGI, or Modified Adjusted Gross Income, and how those methodologies apply to the Medicaid program. We are going to build on top of the knowledge of sort of how those apply to the marketplace and show you the exceptions that are created under the Medicaid programs and why those exceptions exist. So before we get started too far down into the content, I want to make sure to give my boss and colleague, Ann Dunkelberg, a chance to say hi. And like I said, she'll be with us the whole time, taking questions and supporting me in this as I go through the content. Ann, do you want to say hi?
Hi, this is Ann, and today, for those of you who are on last week's call, I was able to answer some of your questions, but this week's, we're kind of going into the upper division material, and I suspect that I'll be more just helping feed the questions to Melissa while she answers them, but look forward to talking to you guys more at the Q&A.
All right, there we go. Sorry about that. My nervous fingers accidentally hit 2 stars when I tried to unmute myself. Okay, so let's get started in the content. We do have quite a bit of content today, so I want to make sure that we get through all of it. It is going to be more dense, just as a warning, than what we did last week. And I also want to warn everyone that we will go through a lot of examples. These examples are going to be the most basic examples you can have, and I want to recognize that this is often not reflective of the reality of the clients that come into your office every day. People have very complicated family situations where they're living with different relatives or in different family structures. And I'm not meaning at all to not acknowledge that. It is simply that this material is best learned first in these more simplistic families, and then you can take that knowledge and apply it piece by piece to the more complicated families that you will see often. So while this is a deep dive, it gets more complicated than this, and I do want to make sure to acknowledge that. All right. So as a very 1,000-foot view, when we're talking about the modified adjusted gross income methodologies, they mostly align with the marketplace. But there are exceptions in place for Medicaid and CHIP, and we're going to talk about why those exceptions exist and where they came from. So I feel like the why really helps you get through the frustration that can occur when you're getting into the weeds of this policy and you're like, this makes no sense. Why would anybody make this so complicated? Well, some of it is politics. Some of it is simply the way that public policy works, and a lot of it is history. So we're going to talk a little bit about that to give you a better understanding of the background. I want to also emphasize the importance of this type of training, the training we did last week, and the importance of this training. I have no expectation that someone would be able to walk away from this presentation and be able to do an income eligibility determination for someone from the marketplace. That's not your job. Your job is to do application assistance. However, you are the individuals on the ground who interact with these clients every day and can identify when things aren't going the way that they're supposed to go. And we want to acknowledge that, and I was part of this team, so I saw this firsthand, that when implementing new Medicaid policy into the Texas Integrated Eligibility Redesign System, or TIERS, it is often like building a plane while flying it. Medicaid applications come in every day. There was no ability for anyone to stop accepting Medicaid applications while we built the new system and then start again. This system had to be changed and built while it was still in progress. And then on January 1st, 2014, we basically had to flip a switch where all of this new policy came into the system. And we are still working through the kinks of introducing such a large amount of new policy, and we're still identifying where those things are going wrong. But the quickest and most effective way for us to identify those things is for people on the ground to help us identify them. And that is why getting a basic understanding of how it's supposed to work will help you to be able to see when things are going the way that they're not, or in a way that they shouldn't. Okay, so what are we going to do today? We're going to go over the basics. This is going to be the sort of elevator speech version of what is modified adjusted gross income for the household and the income as compared to the marketplace. So the very basics and that background piece I talked about. Then we're going to start diving a little deeper, and we're going to first look at household size. So last week, you may remember we looked at a slide with all of the different income levels. So if I say that a child between the ages of 6 and 18 is eligible for Medicaid up to 138% of the federal poverty level, that doesn't mean a whole lot if you don't know how to first calculate the family size, because the federal poverty level is tied to family size, and what income is included and whose income is included. Those are two different questions. So if we know the family size is these three people and it's 3, does the income of all 3 of those people, does it get counted? That's the first question. And then, okay, so now we know that of those 3 people, these 2, their income should be included, maybe mom and dad. So, okay, now what is income? What is the definition of income when you're determining income for Medicaid? So we're going to go through each of those pieces. And I'll warn you, this is a lot of content, so we're going to try to move quickly through it. Please do ask questions, but you may have to go back and watch this a few times to fully understand all of it, because it can be very complicated. Okay, So again, like we said, we're going to start with that high level elevator speech view of what is modified adjusted gross income, household size and income when we're determining eligibility for Medicaid and CHIP. So in general, for all programs, this is the tax subsidies in the marketplace, the cost sharing reductions on the marketplace, Medicaid, Magi-based Medicaid, which we talked about. This is largely children, pregnant women, parent and caretakers, and CHIP eligibility. So for all of those things, in general, their household is going to include the tax filer, their spouse, and their tax dependents. So basically, who is on your tax return? That is generally who is then going to be included in your household size. And then so that's the household size, 1,000-foot view. For income at that 1,000-foot view, you're mostly thinking about the adjusted gross income. So if you can think back and think about when you submitted your income taxes, that 1040, that first page, the very bottom, you use that first page to get to adjusted gross income. So that in general is the income that's included. Now there are a few exceptions that were required under the Affordable Care Act, and that's non-taxable Social Security benefits, tax-exempt interest, and excluded foreign income. And so that's where that modified piece comes in. That's where we have modified adjusted gross income. So that is, in general, what's used for determining eligibility for modified adjusted gross income or for Magi-based Medicaid, CHIP, and the tax subsidies in the marketplace. Now, that's that high level. Now let's talk. We're going to spend most of the rest of the day this morning talking about all the exceptions that exist for Medicaid. So first off, why do exceptions exist? Well, basically what happened is the Affordable Care Act was passed, and they said, okay, for all of the new insurance affordability programs, so the new tax credits that are available in the marketplace, plus Medicaid and CHIP, which already existed, we're going to use modified adjusted gross income as defined in IRS rules to determine eligibility. Well, that was then evaluated, and what was identified was there were certain families that if we just changed it and used the straight up modified adjusted gross income rules, the straight up IRS rules, then there would be these groups of families or situations where someone would have been eligible for Medicaid, and now with this change, they'll no longer be eligible. Or vice versa. They wouldn't have been eligible for before, and they would be eligible now. Or, and finally, one of the main reasons is there are certain things, and if you are an assister who assists in marketplace applications, you'll recognize these things. There are certain things that the marketplace can require of applicants that Medicaid can't. The marketplace is the APTCs, subsidies in the marketplace are tax credits. Medicaid is a federal entitlement program. You can't require someone to file taxes, for example, or file taxes jointly with their spouse in order to receive Medicaid. But under the marketplace rules, those things are in place if you want to receive marketplace subsidies. So all of those different pieces were basically, we can't just use the straight up rules because it's not going to fit quite right. Those were identified, and certain exceptions were made out of that identification. So you've got the list in front of you. We're going to talk about each one of these, so I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples, but don't worry, we're going to look at all of these before the end of the day. So as I mentioned, you can't force people to file a tax return. So you had to have rules in place for people who don't file tax returns and still need an eligibility determination for Medicaid and CHIP. And then another example are pregnant women. There were some historical policies applied to pregnant women, and we're going to go through those in Medicaid and CHIP eligibility determinations that are different than what the IRS rules use. So they wanted to carry those policies forward. Those policies still exist in federal law, and they wanted to carry those forward. So you'll see some exceptions for households that include pregnant women. Sometimes you'll have children who are claimed as a tax dependent by a parent who lives outside of the home. What do you do in those situations? What would the Medicaid determinations be? And again, like I mentioned, you can't force people to file taxes jointly because this isn't a tax credit. It's a federal entitlement program. Medicaid is. So we'll talk about how all of these exceptions impact the policy for determining household size and determining income. This is specifically household size for Medicaid and CHIP programs. And just keep remembering that this makes sense if you think about the history, even though it made the policy fairly complicated. So the same thing exists for when looking at income. There were certain incomes that weren't included historically in a Medicaid determination that they wanted to continue to not include. Those are educational scholarships and grants. There are certain types of scholarships and grants that could technically be taxable, although in general scholarships and grants aren't taxable, but there are certain types that could have been. They wanted to make clear that no scholarships or grants used for educational purposes should be included in Medicaid and CHIP. And there are certain incomes that are received by American Indians and Alaska Natives that have historically been excluded from Medicaid and CHIP that continue to be excluded even under MAGI rules. And then we're going to talk about the cash support thing. Just remember this, that because of some of the household require exceptions, there is this ability for certain types of cash supports in a very small number of scenarios where certain types of cash could be included in income, but it wouldn't necessarily be included in a marketplace income because in general cash payments are not taxable for the person receiving the payment. And we're gonna talk more about that, so don't get too hung up on that. We're going to go into the details. And then finally, as many of you know, when determining eligibility for Medicaid, you're determining the eligibility this month. It's a current monthly income. When you're looking at a marketplace application for subsidies, that's a tax credit. That's an annual tax credit. So you're looking at their annual income. Well, because Medicaid still has current monthly income and the marketplace is annual income, there are differences, and one of those being that when you get a lump sum payment, maybe a bonus or overtime, that's only included in the month that it's received for Medicaid. For the marketplace, it's part of your annualized income and would be included in that annual income amount. So that makes for some slight differences in how income is treated. So that was the 1,000-foot view. In general, MAGI is the people on your tax return and the adjusted gross income on your tax return plus those couple of other incomes like non-taxable Social Security benefits. That's the most likely for a low-income household. And then you've got a couple of exceptions for household sizes and how they count. So in general, that's high-level MAGI methodology. So now let's take that high level and let's dive a little deeper. And then we're going to take some questions after we talk about household sizes. So let's start our deep dive in the household. What's important to remember for household sizes under modified adjusted gross income is it's a person-focused household. Let's take an example. Usually if I'm doing this in person, I choose a group of people sitting at a table. But let's just try to imagine in our head we've got a group of people who all live under the same roof. Maybe mom, dad, and a couple of kids. Well, in determining their household size, I don't just look at all of them and say, okay, there's 4 of you living in this house, so your household size is 4. That's not how it works. You have to look at each individual person, first mom, then dad, then brother, then sister, and look at what their individual household size is. And you're going to see examples of this as we move through the different pieces. And this has to do with the exceptions to the use of the IRS MAGI rules when determining eligibility for Medicaid and CHIP, that you end up with different household size for different people. This slide is probably your most important slide because there are 2 sets of rules that you might use when determining a household size. First are tax filer rules. So these rules apply to all tax filers. And again, these are the rules for who's included in your household size. We're trying to get to that family size number. Are you in a family size of 3 or are you in a family size of 4? So for tax filers, you include the tax filer, their spouse, and they're tax dependent. So it looks a lot like the marketplace application. So people on your tax return, your tax filer, your spouse, and your tax dependent. We're going to talk about the spouse more in detail, but that's in general what you use for tax filers. Now, non-tax filer rules are the individual's spouse, the individual's children, and if the individual is under the age of 19, so if you're talking about a child and you're trying to determine the household size of the child, include their parents and siblings who are living with them and also under the age of 19. Again, you'll notice at the top, all of these people need to be living together. So if you're a child, your parents who are living with you are always included, and your siblings who are living with you are always included if we're using non-tax filer rules. So let's look at a few examples to get started. So let's look at Hank, Mary, and Gabe. Hank and Mary are married and have one child, Gabe, who's age 5. Hank and Mary file taxes jointly and claim Gabe as a tax dependent. So right now I'm trying to give you an example of tax filer rules. So really who we're focused on right now for this side are Hank and Mary. Those are your tax filers. So like we mentioned on the previous slide, tax filers are the tax filer, the tax filer's spouse, and their tax dependent. So what does that mean for Hank and Mary? That means in Hank's household, remember we have to do everybody differently. So follow the columns downward. In Hank's household, of course, himself, his spouse, and his tax dependent. Same thing for Mary, herself, her spouse, and her tax dependent. Now we're going to talk about why Gabe gets to 3 in just a minute. So what is their household size? It's 3. Okay, so those are tax filer rules. Those are super simple. If you've filed taxes, you always use those rules. Now, what becomes more difficult is when we're looking at tax dependent. So in general, a tax dependent, if a person expects to be claimed as a tax dependent on someone else's tax return, then their Medicaid check household will consist of everyone that was included in the tax filer's household. So let's break that down just a little bit and go back to Gabe. Gabe, because he's a tax dependent, his household looks just like Hank's and Mary's household, his tax filers. There are exceptions to this rule, which are listed in the second bullet here. So this is true in general. Number 1 is true unless you've got a child who hits one of these exceptions. The first one is a tax dependent is claimed by a tax filer who's not a parent or spouse of that tax dependent. We're going to give examples for every one of these rules, or every one of these exceptions. Exception 2 is a child who lives with both parents who are unmarried or who file taxes separately. Remember we talked about how you can't force people to file their taxes jointly? Well, because you can't force them to do it in order to determine eligibility for Medicaid, you have to come up with rules for what happens when people don't file together or they're just not married. And number 3, the child lives with one parent but is claimed by the non-custodial parent for tax purposes. So sometimes you may have a joint custody situation where the tax filer who claims that child switches off year to year. Or maybe in certain situations, I always claim this child and you're always going to claim this child just to make it easy. So you'll have these situations where the non-custodial parent is the one who gets to claim the child on the taxes. Well, they needed an exception for that. If a person meets one of these exceptions for the use of tax-dependent rules, then their household will be determined using non-filer rules. So those were the rules that we saw earlier where you count the individual, their spouse, their children, or if they are a child, their siblings and parents. Okay, so let's start looking at all of the exceptions to tax-dependent rules. So I see some questions about grandparents. Well, here we go. Here is how it affects grandparents. Dora is the primary caretaker of her 2 grandchildren, Andres and Sofia. Andres is age 12, Sofia is age 9. She thought it's important that I'm always writing ages because of the rules around if they're under the age of 19. So I'm just making it clear that these children are under the age of 19. She files taxes and claims both children as her tax dependents. Since Dora is not the parent or spouse of Andres or Sofia, they both meet the first exception to the use of tax-dependent rules. Therefore, a non-tax filer or non-tax dependent rules are used when determining the household of Andres and Sofia. So remember, for tax filers, we always use tax filer rules. So Dora's household is straightforward. Who's on her taxes? It's herself and her 2 grandchildren. Now, Andres and Sofia, because they're claimed as a tax dependent by someone who's not their parent, then they meet the exception, and you have to use non-tax filer, non-tax dependent rules. You'll notice in the non-tax filer, non-tax dependent rule, you don't include grandparents in your household. So what does that mean? That means Andres, his household consists of him himself, of course, and his sibling because he's under the age of 19. Same thing for Sofia, herself and her sibling. So their household is only 2, whereas the grandparent's household is 3. We're going to come back to this example when we talk about whose income is included as well. All right, so let's look at the second exception to tax-dependent rules. So this is the exception of your parents don't file their taxes jointly, or they're not married. So Mary and Dave are married and live with their child, Morgan. Mary and Dave file their taxes separately. Dave claims Morgan, age 13, as a tax dependent. Now, since Morgan's parents do not file a joint tax return, she meets that exception, exception number 2. So what does that mean when we're building a household? Well, Mary, we're going to talk about Mary. We're going to come back to this, and we're going to talk about why Dave is included in Mary's household in just a minute. So hold on to that thought. But Mary has a household size of 2, which is Mary and Dave. And then Dave
Can anyone hear me? Please, you guys can hear me? Okay, so I think Melissa must have lost her phone number, so we'll let her know and try to get her back online. Let's see. And I'm going to mute myself again. I apologize for the delay. And Mia will type a message in there for everybody, and we will hopefully be back online shortly.
Can y'all hear me now? Yes.
Melissa,
sorry about that. Yes, it was very bizarre. I could hear you guys talking about how you couldn't hear me, but nobody could hear me. Okay, so sorry about that, everyone. Okay, so as we mentioned, Morgan's parents don't file jointly, so they use non-tax filer rules when determining Morgan's household size, and therefore her parents and herself are included in her household. Oh. Okay, they're asking me to back up, so what I'm going to do is go over this slide again. to make sure you heard all of it. Basically, this is an example of the second exception to tax-dependent rules, which is if your parents aren't married or they don't file or they file separately, then you can't use tax filer rules. You got to use non-tax filer rules. So Morgan's parents file separately. So when we're determining her income, we use non-filer rules, and we include her parents and her spouse. So remember, Mary doesn't actually claim Morgan on her taxes, but because we're using non-tax filer rules, it doesn't matter who claims her. It matters who she lives with. She lives with both Mary and Dave, and therefore they are included in her household. And I am sorry about the audio problem. And so that's the second exception to tax-dependent rules. Remember, there were 3 total, so we're now going to go over the third one. The third one is if a child is claimed by a non-custodial parent. This is one of my favorite ones because it throws people for a loop because you have children in the same household who are siblings, all those step-siblings who have different household sizes. So let's look at John and Lori and their kids. So John and Lori are married. John and Lori are married and live with their 2 children, Paul and Eve. Paul's age 3, Eve is age 8. John and Lori filed jointly, but only claim Paul as the dependent. Eve is from Lori's first marriage, and her biological father claims her as a tax dependent. So since Eve is claimed as a tax dependent by a non-custodial parent, you need to use the third exception to the use of tax dependent rules. So let's go through everybody's household. John and Lori are tax filers. They don't get exceptions, so it's who's on their taxes that creates their household. Paul is a tax dependent claimed by custodial parents. So he also uses tax filer rules, which means his household looks like the household of his tax filers, which means himself and his parents are included in his household. But Eve meets the third exception to the use of tax-dependent rules. We can't use tax-dependent rules here because Eve is claimed by her biological father who does not live with her. So what do we use? We use non-tax filer rules. And what that means is that you include her parents that she lives with. Step-parents are defined as parents, and her siblings. Step-siblings or half-siblings are defined as siblings, all the same thing. So, and herself, of course. So she actually ends up with a household size of 4, where the other parents end up with household sizes of 3. And so that finishes the exceptions to tax-dependent rules. But now let's look at a household that doesn't file taxes at all. This one's, again, very simple. If you don't file taxes, you just use non-tax filer rules, and it looks a lot more like traditional Medicaid would have looked. So Katie lives with her children, Joey and Timothy. She does not expect to file taxes next year because she's not going to make enough income, although, of course, you might encourage her to do so to get that earned income tax credit, but she doesn't plan to. So she ends up with non-tax filer rules for her and her children because they're not tax dependents. They're non-tax filers as well. And everybody is included in everybody else's household because Katie's household includes her children. Joey and Timothy's household includes their sibling and their parent who live with them. Very straightforward for that one. Now, in addition to we're a little bit behind, so I'm going to try to get through these next 3 slides to get to Q&A. But in addition to those exceptions to the use of tax-dependent rules, there are additional adjustments that are made to the household size just for Medicaid and CHIP. We mentioned this briefly at the very beginning. Okay, so let's first look at if a person is married and living with their spouse, the spouse is always included in their household, even if they're filing separately. So this one's a kind of an easy rule to remember. If you're living with your spouse is included, no matter what. And so you'll notice, and we're going to go through this.
just making sure that Melissa is dialing in again. I'm pretty sure she knows that she's been disconnected and will be dialing back in momentarily. I see somebody saying that they can hear her. Oh, you can hear me. Yeah, unfortunately we need Melissa. So she'll be back in momentarily. I am confident. That's good. She's trying to dial back in. What? Can you answer either question? No, I don't think so. Oh.
All right. Can you hear me now? I am very sorry. I'm not certain what's causing my my phone to kick me out. Can everybody hear me? Okay. It says yes.
Back in.
Okay. So sorry about that. Okay. So let's go back to the additional adjustments. I'm going to just start this slide over. So because the first adjustment is easy. So the first one is if you're living with your spouse, they're always included in your household. Doesn't matter how you file taxes. Really doesn't matter across the board. You always include your spouse that's living with you. If you are pregnant, your household size can be adjusted to the number of babies you're expected to deliver. So this applies to Medicaid and CHIP perinatal, because CHIP perinatal is also for pregnant women. So in Texas, this adjustment applies to the household size of anyone whose household includes the pregnant woman for Medicaid. But for CHIP eligibility, so this can get a little bit complicated, but if you have a pregnant teenager, basically, who may be eligible for CHIP, the number of expected babies is included in the family size of that person for eligibility for CHIP, but not in the family size of others included in her household. So this is a recent change. It is something that advocates have voiced concern about because it makes it where for eligibility for all of the other programs isn't aligned for eligibility with CHIP. But it is how I will clarify with an example. Everything is going to get an example. I know that this is very complicated. Okay. So first, let's clarify the example one. Again, it was easy, and we're going back to Mary, Dave, and Morgan. If you remember, Mary and Dave filed taxes separately. Because they filed taxes separately, Morgan ended up using non-tax filer rules for her household size. But if you remember, even though Mary and Dave filed separately, they're both still in each other's households. So Mary still had a household size of 2, even though she was the only one on her tax return. And Dave had a household size of 3, even though the only people on his tax return are himself and his child, Morgan. Now for the second adjustment, let's look at Layla. Layla is pregnant with 1 child and lives with her son, Jack, who's age 2. She files taxes and claims Jack as a tax dependent. Layla and Jack's household size for Medicaid and CHIP perinatal is adjusted by 1 for the number of babies Layla is expected to deliver. Layla is only pregnant with 1 child. So when determining Jack's eligibility for Medicaid and CHIP, Layla's we have a household size of 3 because Layla is pregnant with 1 child. Same thing for Layla if she's applying for Medicaid and CHIP perinatal. Now let's change the situation just a little bit and assume that Layla is 17. If Layla is 17, when we're determining the household size for Jack for the CHIP program, then his household size would only be 2. If Layla were, if Layla were 17 or if Layla were an adult. It actually doesn't matter if Layla is a child. Excuse me for that. If Layla were a child and applying for CHIP, her household size would include her expected child. So her household size would still be 3, but Jack's household size for CHIP is always going to be 2. So I'm sorry if my clarification on this example wasn't clear. So let's go back to this example for if Layla is a teenager and applying, and they look at her household for CHIP, she's still going to have that household size of 3. But when we're looking at Jack's household for CHIP purposes, it doesn't include Layla's expected child.
So I'm going to jump in with a timely question to
Great.
expand on this. If we were looking at, if Layla didn't have another child of her own, but she was in a CHIP, she had siblings who were in CHIP with her, would the same thing be true that for purposes of her CHIP eligibility, she would be counted with the higher family size, counting the baby that she's expecting, but her siblings, for purposes of their CHIP, would not?
That's correct. That's correct. So basically,
make sure we covered that one too. Thanks.
That's great. So the easier way to think about it now that we've had this change, and prior to this change, the expected children were never included in the CHIP household, but it was clarified to HHSC that that's actually not something allowed under federal regulation. The choice is whether you can include them in the households of others. So the sort of simple way to think about this is if you are determining eligibility for someone for CHIP and they are not the pregnant person, then don't include the needs of the unborn or don't include that extra person, the unborn child, in their household eligibility if they are not the pregnant person. So I'm sorry. That's complicated. We are advocating that should be better aligned, but that was the decision that was made by the agency once the clarification from HHSC came about how the CHIP was being done prior to the ACA. All right, so I am going to take a quick break before we move on to income and look at the questions. It looks like we've got a couple that were identified. So we've got Gracie from down in the RGV. What if that lump sum income is in the month of renewal? That could trigger an ineligibility for Medicare or even CHIP. How is this addressed? I've seen denials. Then when the family explains or submits more details of the income, they're asked to reapply because a denial has already been given. Well, there's a couple of issues there. One is this idea of always needing to reapply. In general, we have heard anecdotally, especially through 211, that being told that you have to reapply because they've already been denied. That's not something that is always true, but we're going to leave that reapplication off the table, and I'll tell you what should be happening. The way that the tier system works is that it can actually determine eligibility for the current month and next month ongoing. So what should be happening is if you are ineligible in your current month, and you do need to provide this explanation, the Medicaid agency may not have, unless you clearly state this or it's clearly stated on your income check, they may not know that this was a lump sum and you're not expecting it to come every month. So when helping people apply, make sure that that clarification is put on any documentation that they provide to the HHSC of their income, that this is a lump sum, it's not something that you get every month. So what they can do, let's say I'm applying in August, and I got a lump sum payment in August that put me over income for August. Well, the tier system has the ability to deny your income, deny your Medicaid for August, but start your Medicaid in September and ongoing. If you've provided the HHSC, the agency is still going to need documentation that that is not an ongoing income. So as long as you've given them that information, they should be able to start your eligibility in September and make it ongoing. Now, there are issues around if you've already been denied because there wasn't that explanation and that you're going to have to reapply. We can talk about those things offline just because it's a little off topic for this webinar, but I'll make sure to address that individually offline. Okay.
This is
Caroline Nunu.
Am I unmuted, I hope?
You are unmuted.
Okay. So I just wanted to, Veronica, you had posed a question and then I sent something back to you clarifying it. So if you'll be sure to respond to that, we will get to your question. Thanks.
Okay. So then Caroline
Be clear, Veronica, you have to respond through the chat box. Sorry.
Okay, so for Caroline, she asked, how does the tax, I remember when this got asked, it was about those tax-dependent exceptions. And so we're going to go back and look at the example for the first exception to tax-dependent rules with Dora and her grandchildren on Andres and Sophia. And this is what it looks like when grandparents are raising their grandchild, but they do ask who has conservatorship over the grandchild. Now, this is how it will work in general. One thing I want to warn you, though, is that if a grandparent adopts their grandchildren, from a legal perspective, that is now their parent, even though maybe biologically they were their grandparent. After the adoption, they are then considered to be their parent. And so in this situation, if Dora had adopted Andres and Sofia, then she would be their parent, and they wouldn't meet an exception because they would be claimed as a tax dependent by a parent. So please do understand that when grandparents have legally adopted their grandchildren, they then become the parent. And so even though they're biologically their grandparent, you have to think of them from an eligibility perspective as their legal parent. Okay. And then we have another question. I may have missed this information, but if you have a family that already has a Medicaid case with a pregnant 15-year-old, we send a new app with the same 15-year-old loan for perinatal. If you have a pregnant 15-year-old who's already on Medicaid, I don't actually think that there's any need to then apply for CHIP perinatal, because the Medicaid would cover, they would just be covered in Medicaid. They actually will stay, they may stay in children's Medicaid. If it's a new application in your child, they'll put them in pregnant women's Medicaid because of the outreach programs that are available to them. But if they are already on children's Medicaid, they'll just stay in the children's Medicaid through their pregnancy. But you may want to let the agency know to make sure that they don't end up with a renewal during their birth. But let me take that offline, and we can talk about the different scenarios so that we can, but that really falls more into the application processing, like what we talked about last week, and a little less into household size and income.
So this is Ann. I'll let you take a sip of water. And we do have a question from Ivan, or Ivan, I don't know how he pronounces it. And it says that, and I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this one for a change, but I wanted to confirm it with you. So he's asking, if I have a household of 4 where there's one child who is a stepchild for one of the parents and another common child, and that stepchild, as in your example, is being claimed on the taxes of the non-custodial parent, when the folks, the parents in the household with the 2 children are applying for their common biological child, is the household 3 for that child? And I told him, I am 99% sure the answer is yes, but we're going to get Melissa to confirm that. Are you muted, Melissa?
I was for a second. That is actually the example that we have here in this slide. So Paul is John and Lori's common child. Eve is was just Lori's child from her first marriage, and Eve is claimed by the non-custodial parent. So for Paul, you have just a household size of 3 because he uses tax filer rules, which means that his household mirrors the household of his tax filers, John and Lori. So for John, Lori, and Paul, they all use tax filer rules. So you just look at who's on the taxes each year. But for Eve, because she meets the exception, she uses non-tax filer rules and ends up with everybody in her household. So that's why you have this difference here.
And I think the last question that we have in the queue right now was from Veronica, and she was asking, and we clarified back and forth, if somebody under 19 is over income for Social Security benefits, and by that I'm pretty sure she means disability-related SSI, can someone in that situation qualify for, quote, regular Medicaid, unquote? If we deal with that, Sorry, somebody came and tried to ask me a question while I was trying to talk. Okay, so the bottom line is we are not getting into the disability rules here, which are more complicated, and Melissa understands them, but probably we're not going to be able to delve into those details here. About the only way that a kid with a serious medical condition, but whose family has too much income or resources for them to get supplemental security income disability Medicaid, could get Medicaid would be through one of the special waiver programs that they have. So it is a more complicated topic, and I would invite Veronica to send us an email after the call, and we can get more into the weeds on that. So I'm sorry I can't give you a better answer, and that I'm so easily distracted. Sorry about that.
No, that's great. I should have mentioned that, like we did in last week's call, that this will not include Medicaid based on these presentations are very specific to Magi-based Medicaid, which does not include eligibility for disability or age or blindness, which is a whole other set of Medicaid eligibility rules that was not in general impacted by the Affordable Care Act. Okay, so now I think we've answered all of the questions. Great. I was confirming. And so now we're going to talk about income. Remember that when we're talking about income, there are two questions that we're asking. First, whose income counts? So now we've determined these are all the people that are in the household. Now, of those people in the household, whose income is included? And then the second question is what income is included? So now we know, okay, these two people, their income is included, but what does income mean? What money coming into the home is actually included in income for a Medicaid eligibility determination? So first, let's talk about whose income counts. We're going to go back to, we're going to go back to Dora and her grandchildren. If you remember, Dora, because she is not the parent of Andres and Sofia, is not included in their household. Therefore, her income is not included when determining eligibility for Medicaid and CHIP for Andres or Sofia. So in general, the total household income is the countable Magi-based income of each individual included in the household. So for Dora, for Andres and Sofia, the income of Dora is not included because Dora is not in their household. And again, the reason that this exists is it was old Medicaid eligibility policy that they wanted to carry forward, and it really ties back to old AFDC rules about including the income of people who aren't legally responsible for these children. So even though Dora is their caretaker, she's technically not legally responsible. So I don't need to get into those rules because that's just the old background. But today, the way that it works is if they're not in your household, their income's not included. Okay, so whose income counts? Again, we talked about the general rule is if they're in your household, their income is included. But like we all know, there's always exceptions to every rule, especially with Medicaid eligibility. So first, let's talk about income of tax dependents. So in the event that you have a tax dependent who has income, and again, we're going to have examples for everything, so just hold on tight. If they are included in the household of their parent, the income of the person who is included in the household of his parent is not included in the household income if he's not required to file taxes. So very basically, if you've got a tax dependent who is included, or a child included in the household of their parent, and they don't have to file taxes because they don't make enough money, which a lot of children don't have to file taxes, even if they have maybe a part-time summer job, then you don't include their income. So let's take a look at how that works. How you determine that. Well, every year the tax, and you'll see it's publication 501, IRS comes out with thresholds, and you look at the threshold. If they have unearned income more than $1,050, if they've earned income was more than $6,300, or their gross income was the larger of $1,500 or earned income plus $350. So I'm not going to go through exactly all of the math to get here, but basically if they exceed one of these thresholds, and they only need to exceed one, not all of them, then they may have to file taxes, and therefore their income could be included. So let's take a look at this. Mark and Josie are married, and they filed taxes jointly. They claim their 17-year-old son, Nick, as a tax dependent. Nick works part-time mowing lawns and makes $3,000 per year. Remember, the earned income was threshold for last year was $6,300. So because Nick is included in the household of his parents and not required to file taxes, his income is not included in the household income. So even though Mark and Josie's household and Nick's household include Nick, because he doesn't have to file taxes, his income's not included. Okay, so now let's say that the taxpayer is not a parent or a spouse. If the taxpayer is claimed by a person other than their parent or spouse, the tax-dependent income is not included in the household income of the taxpayer, but it would be included in their own household income. I know that this is probably one of the most complicated policies to try to explain, so I'm just going to jump straight to, and remember, all of this has to do with Medicaid and CHIP eligibility. It was pointed out to me that this didn't have Medicaid anywhere written on this slide, but all of this is for Medicaid and CHIP eligibility. Okay, so let's look at an example, and I'm sorry that this is one of the most complicated examples we'll come across today. So we've got Christine and her niece Jane. Christine is Jane's caretaker, and Jane works part-time as a babysitter and makes $3,000 per year. So Jane is claimed as a tax dependent by someone other than her parent. So remember, that means that she's not included in Christine is not included in her household, okay? Jane's household is determined using non-tax filing rules, and she's not included in the household of her parent. Jane's income is counted toward her own eligibility for Medicaid, even though she's not required to file taxes. So Jane may not make enough to be required to file taxes, but because she's not in the household of her parents, then her income still counts for herself. So she'll still have $3,000. Now, because she's under 18 and our Medicaid limit goes up to 138% of the federal poverty level, or higher depending on how old she is, but because she's 17, I think, she's still going to be eligible, but technically her income is included in her own. But it is not included. So let's say Christine wants to apply for eligibility as a caretaker relative under the parent and caretaker relative Medicaid, which she can, since she is Jane's caretaker. But because Jane is not expected to file taxes, her income is not included in Christine's household income here, because she is her tax dependent and she's not expected to be required to file taxes. So it looks a little different. If we're talking about Christine's application for Medicaid, Jane's income is not included. If we're talking about Jane's application for Medicaid, because she's not included in the household of her parent, then it is included. Okay, so that is whose income counts. Now let's move on to what income counts. This is actually probably one of the easier topics we'll go over today. On the left, you'll see the modified adjusted gross income for the marketplace. We talked about this in the first few slides. You've got the adjusted gross income, that's line 37 of your tax return, plus tax-exempt interest, that's line 8B of your tax return, plus non-taxable Social Security income, that's line 20A of your tax return, and then finally excluded foreign income, and you'll finally get to modified adjusted gross income for marketplace subsidies. I will tell you anecdotally what we hear is the extra income that's often applied to adjusted gross income for low-income individuals is this non-taxable Social Security income. It is rare that they would have tax-exempt interest or excluded foreign income. That's just not something that you would typically see on an income return of a low-income individual. Now, this is what it looks like for marketplace subsidies. Let's build on top of this. So this is still what it looks like for Medicaid, but there are a few exclusions. We mentioned them in the very beginning. First, no matter what scholarships, grants, and fellowships that are used for educational purposes and not living expenses are never included in Medicaid or CHIP eligibility. There are certain times where this may be included as taxable income, doesn't matter. It's not included as long as in Medicaid eligibility, as long as it's used for educational purposes. The second thing are certain distributions and payments to American Indians and Alaskan Natives. Often this has to do with land that accumulates some type of income from fishing rights or something along those lines. That distribution goes to those American Indians and Alaskan Natives and should never be included in their income. They will have to provide verification of their status as an American Indian or Alaskan Native. So those are the things that never included. There is one particular situation where you may include cash support of $50 or more. This is a state option. They chose that $50 threshold when it's provided to a tax dependent from a taxpayer when that taxpayer is not the parent or spouse of the tax dependent. So let's look at Jane here. Jane and Christine, if you remember, Jane is Christine's niece. If you remember, Jane has income, but she's not included, Christine has income but is not included in Jane's household. So her income is not included in Jane's household. But if Christine provides Jane cash support, so let's say she gives her $200 a month, then that cash support is going to be included. I will tell you that, again, generally this isn't going to make anybody ineligible, but it is a difference in how you would do it for the marketplace, and it's important that we acknowledge that difference. But it is only in the situation of when that money is going from a tax dependent to a taxpayer, and the taxpayer is not the tax dependent's parent or spouse. This is super important to remember that it's only in that one narrow circumstance. What is most often seen is, let's say you've got a woman living with her children. She has a boyfriend who lives with her. They are not married. They do not file taxes together. She is not his tax dependent. If he provides her cash support, that is a non-taxable income. That means any money he gives to her as cash support, not taxable, therefore not included. And it won't be included under this rule because she is not his tax dependent. So that is the situation that I hear the most often where questions come up, because people are, oh, well, no, but boyfriend is the one providing all the support. Doesn't matter. That support's not taxable, therefore not included. And it doesn't meet this one teeny tiny exception because she's not his tax dependent. All right. So other differences in the Medicaid /CHIP income. So these are just like little things that I wanted to make sure that we pointed out. We mentioned this, that Medicaid rules always use current monthly income. Marketplace rules always use annual income. So sometimes if I looked at the annual income of someone and I divided that by 12, that is going to be a different number than if I look at how much you make in August. In fact, for a lot of low-income people, their income is going to fluctuate. It's salaried employees that would have a steady income month to month. So because of those rules, it's important to acknowledge that when determining Medicaid eligibility, you're looking at this month's income, not the entire annual income. So I just want to point that out. I will also point out that the state takes into account what's called a reasonably predictable change. And so that means that if you know your income is going to change in the future, let the state know. One way to do that is to provide as many pay stubs as you can. You can provide up to 4. Tiers can take up to 4 different pay statements in the system to average that. So if you had a week that maybe your client worked overtime and got paid more than they normally would, and you know that, document that. Tell the state and provide more paycheck stubs than just that week. If you just give them a paycheck stub for the week that they had all that overtime, then it's going to make it look like they make a lot more income than they do. Or if you know that they're going to lose their job next week, you can document that by getting a letter from the employer. These are all reasonably predictable changes in income. And then finally, the lump sum payment, which we already described. If I get a lump sum payment, for Medicaid only counts the month that you get it. For the marketplace, it's included in annual income. Okay. This gets a little bit small if you don't look at it full screen, but it's a great chart that was put together by Tricia Brooks at the Georgetown University's Center for Children and Families. I highly recommend people going and reading this report, Getting Magi Right. A lot of what I put together today is actually based on how she's laid out this information. So that's a link that will be included in the slides that we'll provide to you. But why this is interesting is it lays out the different income sources where it's changed pre-ACA, which is the second column, to post-ACA, which is the last column. So I'm not going to go through all of them. I just wanted you to have this as a resource. But when you look at like self-employment or farm income, there were certain business expenses that weren't deducted. Well, for MAGI purposes, you use the same rules that the IRS uses. So if you can deduct it in a Schedule C in your taxes, then you can deduct it for MAGI purposes. So it actually improved sort of the documentation of what things were deducted. And that's just an example. We're actually going to look at some of these other examples in a future slide. So the next two sections before we get to Q&A, we're going to talk about common confusion. This is my pet peeve / project, which is Social Security income. We have seen this go wrong. Please, if you're doing something else and multitasking, I just urge you to please pay attention at least to this slide, because I know that there are families out there where they are getting the incorrect eligibility determination because of this particular problem, and we are working with the state to try to get it addressed. But if you do have someone who comes across your desk who has this issue, please feel free to email me, and we can try to get the right answer for their eligibility determination. So what happens is, we talked about one of the exceptions to what income is included is that you always include all of your Social Security income. That is true. But don't forget the other rule of you only include a tax dependent income as long as they're in the household of their taxpayer. You only include their income if they have to file taxes. I can't say this with more emphasis, but the most children who get Social Security income, that Social Security income is not taxable and they don't have to file taxes. Therefore, their income should not be included in the MAGI eligibility determination because they don't have to file taxes. The problem is that it's very specific, different rules that the IRS uses to determine when a person who receives Social Security income, whether or not they have to file taxes. It is different than all the other income types. So I sort of lay it out here, but what's really important for you to take home is that most children, if they don't have any other income, they don't have to file taxes, and their Social Security benefits aren't included. Their parents are likely going to be included because that's an exception to how tax rules work for MAGI. So, but the income of children not included.
Melissa,
income of tax dependents and children. Go ahead.
This is Ann. So while we're on that, because a lot of times informally we may refer, just to reinforce your first bullet there, Social Security income versus supplemental security income.
Yes.
So just to distinguish, you may have some kids who get a Social Security check that's like a survivor benefits check because a parent died, for example, and that's we are talking about not supplemental security income, not the disability-related check that a child would get because of their own disability. Is that correct?
That is correct. And I can clarify that the supplemental security income never included in MAGI. So that's that. Am I saying that right?
I don't know. Say it again.
I'm sorry. Yes. So you'll notice here on this slide, SSI payments, so supplemental security payments, are not included in MAGI. Thank you, Tricia, for putting that in your grid, or I would have forgotten. So supplemental security income never included. Social Security income sometimes included if you're not talking about a tax dependent. But if they're a tax dependent, so if it's the kids that are getting the Social Security income, then likely it's not included because likely they don't have to file taxes. And if you come across this, please do let us know. And then finally, the other common confusions, and we'll start to take questions after this, and we should have a good amount of time to take questions. Child support. So prior to the Affordable Care Act, child support was deducted if you paid it. So it was deducted from your income if you paid child support, or if you received child support, it was considered income. Neither of those things is true anymore. Child support is no longer a deduction, and it's no longer income if you receive it. Why is that? Well, because child support isn't a taxable income, and it's not a deduction that comes that's on that first page of the 1040. So because neither of those things are still are true when you're using MAGI income, child support's not included, coming in or going out. Alimony paid is now deducted from modified adjusted gross income because when you look at that front of your 1040, a person paying alimony gets to deduct that to get to adjusted gross income. And alimony received is considered income. Sometimes I hear, oh, nobody has alimony in Texas. Well, they could have alimony if they got divorced in a different state. And there are ways for people to get alimony in Texas, although it is more complicated in Texas than in other states. So it's still important that you understand how alimony is and isn't included in modified adjusted gross income. And then this one, we have had a case recently that hit this, so this is something very important. Pre-tax contributions made to employer benefit programs. So sometimes these are retirement accounts or flexible spending accounts. They're not taxable. Remember that sometimes people choose to have some of their income diverted to a different use for a benefit, like a flexible spending account. And they do that because it has a tax benefit to them, which means that income is no longer taxable. Well, as long as you're not taxing that income, it's not included in your modified adjusted gross income. Because remember, in general, modified adjusted gross income is your taxable income. So it's really important that you don't include this as wages when you're when you're helping someone fill out their application. That is, you'll notice this is written about in Tricia Brooks's report that I linked in the presentation. What we worry about is that people go and say, how much do you make every month? Well, I'm just going to go look at my pay stub. Oh, it says I make, it says I make, $500. Well, this, some amount of that is actually a non-taxable amount that you've had diverted to some sort of a benefit. Don't include those amounts because if you do, it may look like you're making more taxable income than you're actually making. So it's important that you don't include those. All right, so we are going to go to the Q&A. And we've got a couple questions here. There are less questions here than last week. I'm not surprised this can be an overwhelming and complex presentation. So I do want to encourage you that if you go back over these slides and you have more questions or you have an example that you're not quite sure how it fits, please do feel free to reach out to us. My information will be included and is included in this presentation. Okay, so Vivian.
This is Anne.
Go ahead.
I had some back and forth with Vivian, a clarifier question. So what she's asking is, if I know that this teenager's income of $3,000 or whatever isn't supposed to be counted, am I still required to report it on the application when I apply for Medicaid? And so I think I told her I thought that this would be something you would be good at discussing.
Sure. So yes, you're still going to have to include it. And here's why. The Medicaid agency has to do the same thing that you're doing in your head. We're going to go back to one of these slides that has those thresholds. So the only way that the Medicaid agency can check and say, yes, we know that you don't have to file taxes and we know your income isn't included, is if you tell them how much income they make. Otherwise, they won't know if it's met one of these thresholds. So that is why they're asking for income for tax dependents. Now, if they're asking for an income that is not included in modified adjusted gross income at all, so they want to know, for example, how much cash support you get from boyfriend, and boyfriend is not your taxpayer, no, they can't ask you for that. So the general rule is you can't ask for anything that isn't related to eligibility. So for sometimes you're going to have to tell them, for example, when tax dependents make income and how much they make, because that does impact eligibility or can impact eligibility. But if it's just someone else who lives in the household who provides cash support, and that person is not related to the applicant, either through a familial connection like spouse or they're part of their biological family, or they're not related to them from a tax perspective, then no, they should not be asking for that information. So there are a couple of different scenarios that this could fall under, but the rule of thumb is, could this impact their eligibility? And the answer is, and the answer determines whether or not they can ask for it. We do know that they ask for things that they shouldn't ask for, and please do feel free to let us know if you're seeing a pattern of that behavior. Will monthly self-declared? Oh, sure.
Gracie had a couple of questions about, what the challenges for documenting income for self-employed folks. So there are two of them there. The next two questions are related to that, and I'm definitely over my head on that, so I'm turning it back to
Sure. No, so because the new, and we're going to go to this one to sort of reiterate this point, because the new self-employment rules align with the IRS rules, when you are looking for self-employment income, they are going to ask you for your last tax return. That is what they're going to need for that verification of income. There are other ways to verify income, but if you want to be able to deduct any of the deductions that are included in a Schedule C, you're going to have to provide that tax return that shows that you're eligible to deduct them. Because the sort of rationale that they use is they're not tax experts, so they need verification that the IRS allows that deduction. So in general, for self-employed individuals, for Medicaid, provide the IRS tax statements that they have, the most recent ones. And then it mentions eligibility workers. This is another Gracie question. Look at the detail regarding gross income versus sexual spending count deductions or net income. They don't always look at the detail. You may have to spell this out for them, and we've had some issues with how they've been including this. So please do let us know if you think that there is a person whose non-taxable income is getting included in their household income. We have had that. We are currently working through a case that was identified where this was occurring. And even on the paycheck stub, it's clearly identified as non-taxable income, and we're still struggling. So please do let us know if you're having an issue with that. Go ahead.
You may have caught this and I missed it, but did you get her question about the monthly self-declared income statement? It should be at the top of the question list now.
Yes, and that she may be referring to a specific form, and it may be required. So let me just look at that. I can take that back. But yes, sometimes if you can't document income, you're going to have to do a signed statement to document that income. But we can look back specifically at the monthly declared income form and how it's used now. So I'll take that question back.
So I'm going to assume in Jennifer's question here that it appears that Jennifer has encountered a situation where she had a couple that was unmarried, had a child together, don't file taxes together, and that she is saying that somewhere in that case the child's supplemental security income for disability was being counted. That's a literal understanding of the question she's asked. So, Jennifer, you may need to clarify if I got that wrong, if I'm interpreting your question wrong. And so let's just touch on whether or not the child's supplemental security income should be counted as income for the child's Medicaid.
Yeah,
automatically getting Medicaid if they get SSI.
Yes, and supplemental security payments are never included in modified adjusted gross income.
Jennifer, why don't you, you can follow up with another question, and we can take it offline to email if we can't get to it before the end of the call, so that we can make sure we get to your question. I'm sorry I didn't get that a little clearer. There's a great question from Lucy for you, Melissa, about the check.
Sure, great. So Lucy, we've got a couple of questions about taxable gross income from Lucy. So basically the idea is on a client's check stub, if you can clearly see that there is a taxable gross income versus a current income, what should be used, and often you will see that the taxable gross income is lower because that income could be reduced if you're only looking at the things that are taxable. If you're not including those pre-tax employer contributions, they should not be including the pre-tax employer contributions. If you are seeing that and you need to help your client appeal, please do reach out to us. We can help with that. But the very basic policy is that under modified adjusted gross income, the only thing that can be included is line 37 of a tax return, plus tax-exempt interest, plus non-Social Security income, plus excluded foreign income. That is all that can be included. So if they're including something that isn't in one of these things, which would be true if they're including, for example, your income that you have diverted to your flexible spending account, then it is an incorrect application of modified adjusted gross income methodologies. But we're happy to help you with that, since that is something that we have identified as an issue. And honestly, the more examples we have to provide the state, the more we can show that it's a problem, the policy that they're applying.
We would love it, Lucy, if you have any working relationships with your local eligibility workers, and you can pick up a phone or email them or whatever. I know that doesn't work at all in some places. I mean, if you can point out to them that the check stub has the taxable gross income line, that they should have used that, obviously, rather than having to reach out to us to intervene, that's great. We would love to hear about it, particularly if you don't get an immediate response, oh yeah, we made a mistake here, let us fix it. Definitely you can reach out to us, and again, we will use it to re-emphasize to our Texas Medicaid colleagues that they need more training on this issue. Okay.
I second all of that. And then Ivan, I'm not, wanted to go back to talk about Christine and Jane. This is aunt and niece. And he wanted to double check that the example of the aunt and niece, when applying for the child, aunt's income doesn't count. The income is zero for the child. Well, it is true that aunt's income doesn't count, but actually in this particular example, Jane had a part-time job, so she does have that $3,000 per year. So her income isn't zero, it's $3,000 per year, which is going to put her well under the limit for Medicaid, assuming she's a teenager. So does Christine need to still sign her application? Yes, she is still the head of household. Her information, again, that the household doesn't know, the HHSC doesn't know what you don't tell them. So you need to tell them. Christine would apply for the child. There is a case of independent children, so I'm gonna leave that aside. But right now, Jane is not one of those. Jane has a caretaker, Christine. Christine is the one who applies for Jane, but Christine needs to make it clear on the application that the relationship to the head of household, so you'll see that as a relationship box. You would put aunt, so that they make it clear that you understand this relationship. And in the Magi addendum, where you're describing the tax relationships, make it clear that Christine claims Jane as a tax dependent. You have to tell the agency all of this information in order for the agency to come to the same conclusions that I've come to on the slide. And yes, Christine, as the caretaker, would file the application. If the child was placed by the state in the aunt's household, when do we refer to DFPS? If the child is in a foster care situation, then DFPS will handle the eligibility for Medicaid under the foster care program. So that is a different situation, and if I'm not addressing your specific question, let's talk offline about that, because it can get very weedy. But again, let's leave that one offline.
Yvonne's question is a big question. We probably have 5 times as many kids in Texas living with aunts and uncles and grandparents as we do or kids in foster care. So you've hit on a good point. Is if the child is actually formally in foster care, and the parent has the aunt or uncle has that kind of guardianship, then the child should be automatically getting Medicaid already. There shouldn't be something that you have to do. But if you're finding a kid that's falling through the cracks, then that would be important to note. And like Melissa said, if we've totally misunderstood your question, we'll follow up with you offline.
All right. Well, unless I'm wrong, I'm just in the question piece. So it looks like we have addressed all of the questions. So before we close today, we just have a few little housekeeping pieces. First off, of course, I want to thank everyone for joining us today and being patient with our audio issues, although I do believe the audio went better than it did last week. It was just my phone that was messing up, and I want to apologize for that. We will follow up one-on-one to answer any questions we didn't get to. I think we got to all of the questions, but do feel free to reach out to us if we misunderstood your question or if you think of additional questions. Again, I know this is sort of a weedy topic, so it may take a little while before you feel like you can really formulate a question on this topic. Of course, we will share the presentation slides and the video recording. They'll clean up the recording and take anything else that's not necessary, and we'll share that out. We were able to share that on the same day last week, so it will be very soon this week as well. We have a short survey at the end of the webinar, so once the webinar ends, you'll be presented with a survey. We love your feedback on this. It helps us to determine what works, what doesn't work as far as what we've presented, and there's also some questions there about additional training needs. We will use that as sort of a guide stick for what is important as far as training needs that you'd like to see more of. So we, again, appreciate everybody's time. I don't know, Anne, if you had anything else to say in closing?
No, just thanks to everyone for participating. It was great to have so many folks on the line, and we look forward to thinking of what our next webinar can be.
All right. Great. Thanks, everyone. Have a good rest of your Thursday.